Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start today's program. I am Derek Olson, the president of WorldOregon. It's wonderful to have you here for our first virtual webinar of 2021 for the Great Decision Series, something we've been doing since the 50s here in Oregon in partnership with the Foreign Policy Association. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm just going to say a few words about the series, about some of our upcoming events, introduce the speaker, then we're off to the races. First of all, thank you again for really an overwhelming response, a huge number of folks, including all of you who bought the 2021 series tickets for Great Decisions. And while we wish we could be in person, hosting this event with you, we're doing the safe thing, and we're just thrilled that it allows us to bring in some outside experts who might not have been able to make it to Portland for a live event like today's expert. If you bought just a ticket for today's event only, you're welcome to consider getting a series ticket that's on our website for sale. It's $30. And we have the $5 per talk tickets for the rest of them if you feel that you can only grab a couple series or a couple of talks in the series. Wanted to apologize about the slow shipment from the Foreign Policy Association of the Great Decision books. Tim has been nudging them diplomatically but firmly. It appears that there was some kind of delay in the printing of the books, and we understand that that has affected all their shipments. So across the board, they've been delayed. We apologize for this. It is out of our control. Nevertheless, we sorry that you are affected by this. Hopefully, those books should start arriving next week. Again, if you have not purchased the book, you can do so from the Foreign Policy Association, fpa.org. There's a link on our website on the registration page to get that. Again, we apologize for the delay in shipment. It is outside of our control, but we sympathize with you. Also exciting news, we are going to be launching next week the sales of our International Speaker Series, completely virtual for 2021. Tim and I are just putting the finishing touches on that with our colleagues. So stay tuned next week for information on how to buy series tickets for the International Speaker Series. It's going to be very similar to past series, just virtual instead of in person. If you are not a member, please renew your membership and you'll get a 10% discount off on your purchase. So stay tuned for details next week. And lastly, before we jump into today's event, a reminder that if you are one of the many people who donated and renewed your membership at the end of the year, we're having a special thank you event next Tuesday with NPR sports correspondent Tom Goldman. And all of those who qualified for that should have got an email. We're sending out a reminder today with the registration link. Now, without further ado, today's talk, Great Decisions, China's Role in Africa. This is the first of our 8-part series. It'll be every Friday from 12 to 1 from now through mid-March. And we're honored today to have Professor David Hamilton Shinn, who you might recognize his name because he is a former ambassador and wrote an article that was in last year's Great Decisions about the Red Sea. That we, the one that we had the video from the Foreign Policy Association that narrated by David Strathern about his article. Today, Ambassador Shinn is going to be talking about China's role in Africa. He's a very experienced ambassador with over 37 years in the State Department, was ambassador to Burkina Faso and Ethiopia, and has been teaching since 2001 in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He has a number of publications and works with a great deal of think tanks, has partnered with our very own Ambassador Mary Carlin Yates, who's a retired ambassador on our board of trustees. And without further ado, we are thrilled to have Ambassador Shinn join us this morning.
Thank you very much, Derek. I'm very pleased to join you, and I'm speaking to all of you from Washington, D.C., although I think it might better be named Fort Washington these days. We live 8 blocks behind the U.S. Capitol building, and it's almost an armed camp within a couple of blocks of our house, and I gather it's going to remain that way. I want to say just a word about the Great Decisions book that you have not received. The section on China and Africa was written by Cobus van Staden. Cobus is a friend of mine, South African, very good guy, has spent a lot of time dealing with the China-Africa question. He's done a very good piece of work for Great Decisions. His approach to the topic is a little bit different than mine in that his is very topically oriented. I will try to give you a broad brush overview of the entirety of the China-Africa relationship in about 25 minutes maximum, whereas he looks at it topic by topic. We disagree on very little, however, in terms of how we see the China-Africa relationship. I want to start by looking at what I consider to be China's 5 hard interests in Africa. And by hard interests, I mean, what does China want from Africa, not what it can do for Africa? Very important distinction. And the first item that I would argue that China wants is access to raw materials. 96% of all of China's imports from Africa are oil, minerals, and timber. 18% of all of China's imported oil comes from Africa. It's actually a declining number. It imports a much larger percentage of key minerals like cobalt, chrome, manganese, and tantalum. All of this helps sustain China's economy. That keeps the Communist Party in power, and that's frankly what it's all about. The second interest that China has is to increase exports to Africa. Africa has well over 1 billion people and increasing numbers of consumers with discretionary income. It's becoming a more attractive export market, and it's a good way to earn foreign exchange. The third interest is to obtain the political support of as many African countries as one can. 54 countries in Africa, that's more than 1/4 of the membership of the United Nations General Assembly. It is also a matter of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours in places like the UN Human Rights Council and other specialized agencies of the United Nations. The fourth interest is to end Taiwan's diplomatic presence in Africa. Today, only one country, Eswatini, used to be called Swaziland, recognizes Taiwan. China has an unrelenting focus on insisting that all countries recognize Beijing and not Taipei, or it will have nothing to do with them. And the fifth interest that China has is to minimize the impact in Africa of a series of negative things like terrorism, international crime, narcotics trafficking, piracy, pandemic disease impacts, so that these don't harm China's interests either on the continent or conceivably even back home. Chinese nationals increasingly are subject to terrorist attacks in Africa. Small numbers of Africans have engaged in narcotics trafficking in China, and Chinese ships and crews were at one point subject to Somali piracy. Just by way of comparison, what are US interests in Africa? And again, looking at it from the standpoint of what does the US want from Africa? First, it's to maintain access to raw materials, especially oil, although that is declining. Those interests are declining rapidly because of fracking in the US and little need for oil. Second is to increase exports to Africa to earn foreign exchange. Third is to obtain maximum African political support in international forums. Fourth is to minimize the impact in Africa of terrorism, narcotic trafficking, international crime, piracy, money laundering, etc., so they don't harm US interests. Sound familiar? Well, 4 of the 5 interests are identical to China's. US has one interest that China does not yet have, but it is fast approaching this interest, and that is it wants to have US naval access to African ports and the ability of military aircraft to overfly African countries and land at African airports. China now has its first base in Djibouti and is approaching that interest that we currently have. Let me take a look at what China does in order to maintain this very strong relationship with the African countries. In the first instance, they are probably best at the government-to-government relationship. China has diplomatic relations with 53 of the 54 countries. It has an embassy in all 53. The one in Tripoli and Libya may be temporarily pulled out for security reasons. By comparison, the United States has diplomatic ties with all 54 countries in Africa, but it only has an embassy in 48 or 49. Some of the smaller countries, the US has decided it doesn't have the funds to have an embassy. All 53 countries that recognize Beijing have an embassy in Beijing. China emphasizes its high-level visits to the continent. President Xi Jinping made his first overseas visit after taking power to Africa and went through Russia in order to get to Africa, but the first real visit was to Africa. More importantly, every year since 1991, without exception, the Chinese foreign minister visits Africa in order to show the Chinese flag, in order to underscore the relationship between China and Africa. And indeed, this year, the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, just returned from his visit to 5 countries in Africa. Senior Communist Party officials also are frequent visitors to Africa, and the Communist Party has developed very strong links with a number of ruling parties in Africa. Beijing welcomes African officials. There's a constant parade of senior African civilian and military leaders to Beijing. In the year 2000, China established the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which coordinates interaction with Africa, and they meet at either the foreign minister or the presidential level every 3 years, alternating between China and a country in Africa. On the trade side, China became Africa's largest trading partner in 2009. Total China-Africa trade peaked at over $200 billion in 2015. It fell to $140 billion in 2016, and then slowly began to rise again until it reached $192 billion in 2019, but it's still below its peak trade year of 2015. Africa accounts for less than 5% of all of China's global trade. On the other hand, it accounts for 15% of all of Africa's global trade. So it's a very important trading partner, and it's far more significant in trade than is the United States. Total China-Africa trade was pretty much in balance from 2000 to 2011. Since then, the trade balance began to favor China with trade surpluses, and that has continued up to the present year. There are also huge disparities in bilateral trade. 15 mostly African and oil mineral exporting countries had trade surpluses with China in 2018. 27 African countries had trade deficits with China. Most of them were quite large. 5 African countries had balanced trade, and 7 countries had negligible trade with China. Interestingly, 2 oil or mineral exporting nations, South Africa and Angola, accounted for well over half of Africa's exports to China in 2018. Most Chinese exports to Africa are high-value manufactured goods, things like transportation equipment, machinery, electronic products, which account for more than half of all Chinese exports to Africa. Looking at the investment numbers, unfortunately, reliable foreign direct investment figures are not available. A lot of numbers floating around out there, and you need to be really careful with all of them. It's not even clear how China defines outward foreign direct investment. China's official figures, in my view, understate the amount of their investment in Africa. As of 2019, China said its cumulative FDI stock in Africa totaled $49 billion. That would be under the American cumulative FDI stock in Africa. But I think the real Chinese number is probably higher than 49 million. The China Global Investment Tracker, it's a joint initiative of the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, put China's FDI in Africa in 2017 at about $83 billion. The annual Chinese FDI flows to Africa are only about 7% of the global annual FDI flow to Africa. So in terms of global annual flows, China's important, but it's not that overwhelming of a player. There's a lot of misinformation floating around out there about the current Chinese role in Africa. Western investment in Africa collectively is much, much greater than Chinese investment in Africa. South Africa, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zambia, Ethiopia, and Nigeria account for about 42% of all of China's foreign direct investment stock in Africa as of 2018. Looking at aid, China treats aid figures as a state secret. They will give you a global annual figure. They will not break it down by aid to individual countries. So all we know about that really is what the African governments tell us. And there's also a problem in that China does not use the OECD definition of aid. So sometimes you're comparing apples and oranges when you're comparing China's aid figures to Western aid figures. And until 2018, there was no central Chinese aid agency, which complicated the compilation of data. China created in 2018 a central aid agency under the State Council to assume responsibility that previously was exercised by the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Most of China's aid to Africa is that part of a loan that is considered concessionary, not the principal that you have to pay back, but the concessionary component only, and a growing amount of grant aid. There's also a small percentage of interest-free loans, and just under half of China's foreign aid global foreign aid goes to Africa. China's OECD equivalent aid to Africa in recent years has been running annually at about 1.5 to 2.5 billion dollars. This compares with about $8 billion annually from the United States. China says it has no political conditions attached to its aid, which is partly true, except of course for the one China principle. You must recognize Beijing and not Taipei. But aid is usually tied to Chinese companies and materials. Once it gives a loan or offers a loan to an African country, a Chinese company by contract will win that contract. There's also often a percentage of Chinese labor which is tied to the loan. African governments clearly prefer non-conditional aid. Western countries often impose conditions on democratization, human rights, economic policy reform, and not surprisingly, the African governments don't like that. There's a lot of confusion over large China Export-Import Bank loans to Africa. They do fill a void that other governments are not offering, and they're highly attractive frequently as compared to commercial bank loans, but these are loans and the money has to be repaid. Chinese companies benefit from the loans because they are building the infrastructure in Africa that the loans are used for. China's financing of infrastructure in Africa averaged $12 billion annually between 2011 and 2016. That's a lot of money going into Africa for loans for building infrastructure. Turning to soft power, from 2012 to 2016, African students received many scholarships to study in China, as many as 40,000 during that period of time. About 80,000 African students are studying in China today, compared with about 40,000 studying in the United States today. It used to be that the United States had far more students from Africa than China did. That situation is now very much reversed. Since 1963, more than 20,000 medical personnel have served in 51 African countries. On the other hand, China tried to establish a youth volunteer program looking much like the US Peace Corps program, and it was a total flop. China also is very active in the media field. Its government news service, the biggest one in the world, Xinhua, has more than 20 bureaus in Africa. China Radio International has become exceedingly active in numerous languages on the continent, and China Global Television Network is also found throughout the continent now. The Communist Party of China arranges tours in China for African journalists, kind of a strange organization to arrange tours for journalists, one would think. There are 61 Confucius Institutes on African university campuses and 13 Confucius classrooms in high schools. They teach Chinese language, history, and culture in 45 African countries. Looking at the military security relationship between China and Africa. It all began back in the late 50s through the 1970s when China was supporting African liberation movements. As the liberation movements achieved power on the continent, many of the liberation leaders becoming future African presidents, the nature of the security relationship changed and became more traditional. In the meantime, it's important to point out that Africa is a low security priority compared to China's periphery and Western powers. But because China does rely increasingly on Africa for minerals and a fair amount of its oil needs, it does have a security component to it, to the relationship. China has some kind of a security link with every African country with which it has diplomatic relations. Some cases, this may be nothing more than military exchange visits. From 2008 to 2012, China's share of conventional arms deliveries to all of Africa was only 8%. It increased to 17% from 2013 to 2017, when Russia was the largest supplier at 39%, most of that going to North Africa. And China has become an increasingly important supplier of arms since these numbers were released. These figures also exclude small arms and light weapons, of which China is a major supplier, but we just don't have good information on those numbers. China has 22 defense attachés in Africa. Some are accredited to multiple countries on the continent. There are actually more African defense attachés in Beijing, 35 of them as of 2018. As China's presence expands in Africa, Chinese nationals increasingly become subject to attack. The biggest problem they ever faced was in Libya in 2011. When the government fell there, the country became chaotic. China had to evacuate 36,000 contractors from Libya. After the situation stabilized a bit, they started to return in subsequent years, but then China found that it had to evacuate another 1,000 from Libya in 2014. The number of incidents that Chinese nationals have encountered in recent years in Africa has a long list attached to it. For example, in 2014, 10 Chinese construction workers were kidnapped in Cameroon by Boko Haram. 2015, 3 senior managers were killed during a terrorist attack at the Radisson Blu Hotel in Bamako, Mali. In 2016, 2 Chinese peacekeepers were killed and 2 were seriously injured during an attack in South Sudan. And China has had to face the problem of piracy off of the coast of Somalia in the Gulf of Aden. Although that problem has essentially come to an end today, there was a time when Chinese ships and crews were experiencing serious difficulties. China contributes about 2,100 troops, staff officers, experts to 5 of 7 UN peacekeeping operations in Africa. That is more than any other UN Security Council permanent member, but it's far less than countries like Ethiopia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Rwanda provide for UN peacekeeping operations. China is the second largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping budget at 15% of the total budget. The US is largest at 28%. China's performance in peacekeeping has been generally praised. China has in Djibouti its first military base outside of China, and I think it's the first of more to come. Let me wrap up very quickly with some challenges and some problems that I think China faces in Africa. I've alluded to some of them. African civil society, opposition political parties, independent labor unions are skeptical of China's role in Africa, not surprising. China domestically does not have opposition political parties, strong civil society, or independent labor unions. Some Africans criticize China's unwillingness to encourage better human rights and democratic governance, usually civil society, not African governments. Chinese and Western arms end up in conflict zones in Africa. We're finding them increasingly in the Eastern Congo, Darfur and Sudan, Somalia. China's policy is to keep them out, but the huge quantity of Chinese arms in the continent today pretty much guarantees that some of them are going to make it into conflict zones. And China does not adequately monitor arms transferred to governments. And the governments then often transfer them to their favorite neighboring rebel group. There is a concern that large Chinese loans may undercut efforts by the World Bank and the IMF to encourage good governance. This is all part of the current debt problem. And clearly China does add to the debt issue. Some Chinese companies have a poor record on worker safety and following local labor laws. There are periodic problems with counterfeit and adulterated Chinese goods that make it into the African market, just as they make it into the market in China and even into the American market from time to time. And African countries are simply ill-equipped to deal with these problems. China is trying to prevent this because it's an embarrassment for China to have this kind of an issue. China's environmental record has been criticized, but again, China's trying to improve upon it. There's a surfeit of cheap products entering Africa from China. These tend to undermine the sale of African-produced goods and harms African industries that are trying to compete with Chinese goods. You also have an influx of Chinese traders that is driving some African traders from the market, literally Chinese who show up in the African market and compete head-to-head with their African counterparts. Chinese have cheaper products. They're often willing to work longer hours and sometimes accept lower profit margins, giving them a bit of a leg up. I'm going to stop there because I am told that this group in particular has outstanding questions. I've done a lot of these great decisions events over the years, and I'm just looking for the best set of questions that I've ever had. So Derek, the problem is back to you or back to Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. This is Tim DeRoche. Welcome everyone back to Great Decisions for yet again another year. I'm sorry I can't see you in person, but it really heartens us to see so much great support for this program, which we have been doing since 1953. So let's just jump right in. I'm wondering if you can review the One Belt, One Road initiative and talk about it with respect to Africa and how it has accelerated China's presence in Africa.
Yeah, good question. The One Belt, One Road, which was initiated by President Xi Jinping in, I believe it was 2013, frankly, didn't even include Africa as a serious member at the beginning. And if you go back and read all of the early literature on the Belt and Road Initiative, you almost can't find a reference to Africa. The Africans picked up on that pretty quickly, and in their interaction with the Chinese, they said, "Hey, wait a minute. You've got this funny little map that shows a maritime Silk Road that touches at Mombasa and goes through the Suez Canal, and I guess that's your Belt and Road Initiative. But what is it? Does this really mean anything for Africa or not?" I think China realized that it probably made a bit of a mistake in how it introduced the BRI as concerns Africa, and quickly did some shifting around of how it approached the topic, and it made a major effort to reach out to Africa and include it, to the point that the Belt and Road Initiative now includes, if they wish, all 53 countries in Africa that recognize Beijing. 46 of the 53 have signed Belt and Road Memoranda of Understanding with China now. A few of them, for whatever reason, have not. And Africa is considered to be an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But when you really look at it, even today, and try to divine what does it mean for Africa, I would argue that it's more of an initiative in name than in reality, in that it basically is taking all of the infrastructure projects that China was doing in Africa even before the Belt and Road was announced, and all of a sudden put them under the umbrella of the Belt and Road, and then adds new infrastructure projects, most of which it would have been doing anyway, with or without the Belt and Road, and calling that the Belt and Road Initiative. So in a sense, it's a continuation of what China was doing before the Belt and Road Initiative ever existed. I think that in the case of Central Asia, South Asia, the Belt and Road has some real meaning, real importance. But for Africa, I think it's a way of simply putting a label on what China's policy has been for the last couple of decades.
So I'm curious how you see the next administration changing either or both the US-China dynamic and US policy toward Africa. Do you see that shifting?
Yeah, let me confine my remarks not more to the impact on Africa. I don't really want to get into the US-China link, because that's not the sort of thing I've been focusing on, and I would probably wander off base pretty quickly if I delved into that. But on the relevance of Africa to the China-US relationship, I do see some changes. It's not entirely clear how it's going to play out, but you will recall that the Trump administration basically made its Africa policy a competition with China and Russia policy. It got it all backwards, in my view. It should be focusing on what it wants from Africa and how it wants to interact with Africa, not try to work through the relationship by how do you deal with China and Russia in Africa. Now, are there going to be areas for competition with China and Russia in Africa? Absolutely, and they will continue into the Biden administration. But to have that as the focus of your policy is just wrong-headed. And I don't think it got us anywhere. Well, it did get us into trouble, is what it got us into. You had the African leaders coming back and saying, we don't want to choose between the US on the one hand and China or Russia on the other. We have no interest in doing that. We want to get from all of you what we can get from all of you, not make a choice and jump in the camp of China or jump in the camp of the US and then have to live with that for the rest of an administration. So the Africans reacted badly to it at the leadership level. And I don't think it got the US anywhere in terms of what it accomplished. It was focused on an effort to increase American trade, American investment in Africa. Frankly, that did not happen. Trade has gone down, investment has gone down during the Trump administration. And it seemed to be predicated on the American private sector would make all of this work and all of it happen. That the US government could just stand back and let the private sector manage US policy in Africa to compete with China and Africa. With all due respect, it doesn't work that way. So I think the Biden administration will have to tweak this. There will be competition will continue, particularly on the security side. And we will have to be very careful where China goes following the establishment of its base in Djibouti and what happens after that. But as far as maintaining this focus on competition with China and Africa as our Africa policy, I really don't see that happening.
So here's a good question on public health. What role, if any, has China played in public health programs in Africa, for example? Were they involved in the efforts to combat AIDS, Ebola, or more recently COVID-19? And do they contribute to family planning in the absence of US aid in this area?
Yeah, good point. China's been very active in the public health side. It was one of their original programs. One of the factoids that I mentioned in my opening remarks is that every year since 1963, China has been sending these public health teams to African countries, and it has continued up to the present day. It's one of its major programs, and I would argue one of their most successful programs. They used to be called the so-called barefoot doctors, which was ridiculous. They were never barefoot. Maybe they wore sandals, but these are by and large professional medical personnel. Some of them engage in traditional medicine also, but that's popular in Africa, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. That is the original part of their health program. Now, since the 1960s, they've expanded into a number of other areas. One of them was not HIV/AIDS. China, as I recall, did very little in that field. The US was the big player on HIV/AIDS and still is. China did play a significant role on Ebola, and there actually was some US-China cooperation in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea in combating Ebola when it broke out several years ago there. I don't think China has been involved in Ebola when it broke out recently in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it still has an interest in Ebola. It has taken a huge lead on the coronavirus problem, mainly in terms of delivering PPE and now vaccine, the Chinese vaccine, which has a spotty track record up to the moment, to countries in Africa. And it's making a major propaganda effort with that. Every time an airplane lands with a plane load of masks or something, it gets enormous publicity in the country that it lands in. So it's very active on the coronavirus side, much more active, at least on the surface, than the US is. Although I think the United States has probably provided more money to African countries to deal with COVID-19.
So I've seen Chinese road construction crews in Africa seeming to replace European companies that used to do this work. They appear to have Chinese supervision and large equipment operators and African manual labor. So are Chinese efforts there to help build infrastructure, create business for Chinese companies, or to help governments that may then be more friendly to China, or all of the above?
It's all of the above plus one more, to make money. Those projects are all based on loans. And in some cases, the loan might actually be from the World Bank, and China happens to win the contract because they're the lowest bidder. And they usually are the lowest bidder on most of these road construction projects and railway construction projects and bridge projects and dam projects. They're well established throughout Africa with their big construction companies. They're good at it. They're fast, and they're relatively cheap. Sometimes the quality is not all that great, but that's another story. But they get these projects because oftentimes they're financing them. This might be the African, or rather the China Development Bank. Sometimes it's the African Development Bank, and they win those contracts too. But you're quite right. They will usually have Chinese equipment, Chinese managers, Chinese supervisors, usually have African labor. At one time, they often had Chinese labor, which was a problem. And I think China's been slowly rectifying that. But they're doing this in no small part to make money.
So has China been supportive of African trade integration and liberalization efforts? Are there any efforts to engage Africa in RCEP or is there any Chinese equivalent of AGOA or GSP? And thank you, Karen Godden, for all of the acronyms.
There is a Chinese equivalent of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. They don't, if it has a special name, I guess I don't recall it or don't remember it, but in effect, China allows certain products from the poorest African countries to enter China duty-free. Unfortunately, it has not made much of an impact on what Africa sells to China, because Africa just does not have that much that China wants, other than oil, minerals, timber, raw materials, in other words. China's not much interested in anything that's produced, any industrial product that comes out of Africa. So there is an equivalency there. There was another part to that question there. You mentioned AGOA and you mentioned
RCEP.
Okay, someone's going to have to jog my memory on what RCEP is.
Well, maybe Karen Godden will chime in. Well, I don't see her.
Not handy. Okay.
Let's.
I thought you mentioned the one other item that was not an acronym. It was AGOA and trade.
Trade integration and liberalization efforts.
Liberalization, that was it. Yes, China is very active in encouraging trade consolidation in Africa. There's a new African initiative to try to have an Africa-wide sort of free trade agreement, which China says it fully supports. And I believe the United States says it fully supports it also, but China has been far more active in expressing its support for this initiative than has the United States been. I'm not quite sure why. And I don't know whether it will result in any sort of tangible Chinese support for the initiative. But at least rhetorically, China is fully in favor of this new initiative by the African countries to establish a continent-wide free trade agreement.
Okay, RCEP is China's Asian equivalent of TPP. That was the
okay.
Yes, it is. Stands for, this is Derek, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as one of our attendees just put in the chat.
Okay, okay. I would say that China has, I mean, again, they express rhetorical support for all of the African regional organizations, whether they're economically focused or politically security focused. China has a relationship with almost every one of them. There are a couple of them that are essentially non-functional, and China doesn't have much of a relationship with those two or three, but all of the others it has a strong relationship with, for the most part, as does the United States.
So I'm wondering if you could speculate on the nomination of Samantha Power as the administrator of USAID and what that might mean for possible policy changes toward Africa.
Well, I'd really be guessing here. I certainly know of her. I don't know her personally. I've read some of her work. She did one of the best things that's ever been written on the genocide in Rwanda. She's quite liberal. She tends to be focused on human rights issues, humanitarian issues. I assume all of that will be reflected in her role as the head of USAID. She is very bright and certainly very knowledgeable in foreign affairs, very knowledgeable about Africa. So I think you're going to see USAID take a much more active role in Africa than you saw during the Trump administration. What her initiatives will be, I don't know. I haven't seen anything that she has written in the last year or so on how she sees the continent developing. But you can be assured there will be a very strong focus on human rights and on anything to do with humanitarian side of the relationship, and almost certainly a more active engagement specifically in Africa than we have seen.
Well, it is worth noting also that Samantha Power was a lead speaker in our International Speaker Series here this last year, speaking about her book, The Education of an Idealist, and she was quite a phenomenal speaker. So.
Yeah, no, she's a real force to deal with. Anyone who has not, I think the item that she wrote on the genocide in Rwanda, I think it was in the Atlantic many years ago. But my guess is if you plug her name into Google and genocide in Rwanda, that article will pop up. It was a brilliant piece of work.
She actually spoke for us when her book on that came out, I believe in 2005, maybe, or two, I can't remember. It all blurs together.
Yeah.
So you touched a little bit on soft power, and you mentioned China's strong media presence in Africa. Could you see Voice of America stepping up and reforming some of its recent more radical policy moves to compete with or be in the same space as where China is with media in Africa?
Yeah, and in all fairness to VOA, although they've gone through some really recent difficult times because of leadership issues, but I'm sure all of that will change quickly after January 20. VOA is still a major player in Africa, in the world generally. And I think it would be fair to say that Voice of America radio and television probably get far more following in Africa than all of the Chinese media do. VOA has been around longer, it's better known. It's known to be more neutral in its politics than China and Chinese media are. All of the Chinese media are government controlled, and at least VOA has the semblance of neutrality as part of its mandate. And VOA operates in more languages than the Chinese media do. And the Chinese media has had some just technical problems. For example, when I was traveling through Nigeria several years ago, they had just set up a Hausa service, China Radio International, which was interesting. I mean, for China to have a Hausa service. Well, VOA has a Hausa service, and BBC has one, and maybe a few other countries have a Hausa service. I asked my Nigerian friends, well, what do you think of China's Hausa service in Nigeria, northern Nigeria? And they kind of smiled and said, well, you know, it's kind of interesting, but not too many people listen to it because they were, at the time, they had Chinese Hausa speakers. Well, I can't imagine Chinese speaking really superb Hausa. The other organizations, VOA, BBC, would use a Nigerian Hausa speaker who would obviously speak native Hausa, and it isn't going to sound funny. If you've got a Chinese doing it, it's going to sound kind of funny. Now, they may have rectified that problem, but these are all learning experiences for China. And I think that you get new leadership in VOA in the coming months, VOA will be back as good as, or if not better than ever.
So has China been involved in collective security efforts against Boko Haram and similar movements like in Somalia?
Yeah, China's efforts are, they're very different than the American way of dealing with this. They will provide training mainly in China. They will sell equipment. For example, there was a point at which the US refused to sell armed drones to the Nigerian government to combat Boko Haram. The US was concerned they'd get into the wrong hands, or they'd be abused, or they would simply be misused. And as a result, did not allow a sale. China immediately sold the armed drones to Nigeria and continues to sell them. And they've done a lot of selling of military equipment to countries that are dealing with either terrorist threats or rebel threats or whatever. And they're much more quick to do that than the United States is. What China does not do, at least has not done so far, is to engage in kinetic military activity in Africa. They don't have special forces in different parts of the continent, for example. And they've done very little training in Africa. They've done some, but mostly in connection with training Africans how to operate their newly sold military equipment. So they're going about the relationship very differently. They do have a lot of ship visits to African ports, far more than the US has today. But those are mainly flying the flag, sort of engaging in humanitarian interaction with the local African militaries, that kind of thing. So they're getting increasingly engaged, and the base in Djibouti may signal a change in the way they approach Africa, but so far it hasn't changed that much other than the base in Djibouti.
So there are many American-based NGOs working around humanitarian issues to help the poorest in Africa, largely through indigenous staff with funding from donations and US money through USAID. Does China have any equivalent of that in Africa?
I'm sorry, does China have any equivalent of which?
Of humanitarian-based NGOs that are working with the poorest communities?
Yeah, good question. An interesting one also. By the way, I just saw a note from Mary Yates reminding me to mention Chinese peacekeepers in Africa, which is an important part of their security relationship. There are about 2,100 Chinese peacekeepers at 5 of the UN operations in Africa today. The biggest one being South Sudan. They're currently in Darfur, but Darfur is shutting down as of the end of December. And all the peacekeepers, including the Chinese, will be leaving. They're still a major contributor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Mali. As far as NGOs or organizations, sort of civil society type organizations that are so prolific in Africa from Western countries, countries like the United States, China has very, very few of these because they don't really exist in the same way in China. And they really tend to be what we call gongos, or government NGOs. Now, there are a few that are independent. You have China House in Nairobi, Kenya, that I've worked with, which seems to have a lot of independence. And it does a lot of sort of research work, a little bit of humanitarian work. But I can count on 1 or maximum 2 hands the number of Chinese organizations that would qualify as a true non-governmental organization that have had any engagement whatsoever in Africa. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, particularly under the Xi Jinping government, where there seems to be so much direction from the top.
So has China been active in renewable energy projects on the continent versus traditional interest in oil and gas projects?
Yeah, they're very active in renewable energy, mainly from the standpoint of solar panels. They're probably the major collaborator on manufacturing solar panels in Africa. In theory, this is designed to be a profit-making activity, working with African counterparts to sell the panels. They have supported some research on renewable energy. They certainly talk a good line on supporting renewable energy in Africa. And they probably have been more active than the United States has been on renewable energy in Africa, everything considered. So they very much consider this as part of their portfolio on the continent.
So with Africa's long history of autocrats and one-party states, does China have a goal of exporting their governing model to any African countries, or is it purely an economic one?
Well, China says it has no goal of exporting its model. And in a technical sense, that's probably true, and that China understands that its precise governance model probably wouldn't work anywhere else in the world, not to mention the African countries. There are too many differences between any individual African country and China. On the other hand, there are parts of what China has done that have been very successful that may or may not work in Africa. Some of them are being tried, like some of these export zones that are being set up. They're huge in China. They're quite small in Africa. And some of them seem to be working in Africa, some less so. There are some African countries that are very interested in China's educational system and are trying to model elements of that. You have to look at it piece by piece. And I think there are elements of what China has done. And goodness knows it's done a huge job in reducing poverty in China. And that's what the Africans want to do, is reduce poverty in their own countries, or at least they say they do. So they see China as something of a model for that. The problem is there are a lot of differences between Togo and China. And Togo just can't say, well, we're going to do what China does and everything will be well and good with the world. It's not going to work that way. But there may be some lessons that Togo can learn from China.
Well, we are coming up to the end of our hour, and I want to bring Derek back on. Ambassador, great answers, and thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. And hopefully we will see you all here again next week.
And I would like to just add, I think you guys, either you win or you get real close to winning for best questions.
Well, thank you for that praise. Our members and our audience is surely an incredible bunch. And I got to say, this is a wonderful way to start great decisions. And it had much the same, I think, give and take with the audience. Thank you, Tim, for moderating those probing questions. We hope you join us next week, January 22nd, for Brexit and the European Union with Professor Allison Johnston of Oregon State University. If you just bought a ticket for today's event and you're so intrigued you want to get the whole series, put the link in the chat. You can sign up for that. A special thanks to our sponsors, including the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, companies like Nike, and higher ed institutions throughout the state who make this possible. Again, we look forward to seeing you in future great decisions. These will be posted to YouTube the week after they are held live. And once again, Ambassador Shinn, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and time with us today.
Thank you, Derek. And just a shout out to Mary and John Yates, assuming both of them are still there.
Yes, Ambassador Mary Yates, who sits on our board of trustees, has a wealth of experience and knowledge herself and has really helped to connect WorldOregon and our members to this amazing array of talent, including Ambassador Shinn today. So thank you, Mary and John. Thank you, audience, and keep an eye out next week for information about the launch of the International Speaker Series. We're very excited about that. We think you will be too. All the best. Stay safe.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.